This is the Straight Up Breakdown Podcast.
Exclusively on the Hurrdat Media Network.
Tell it to me straight up.
Hello, and welcome into the Straight Up Breakdown Podcast, proudly part of the Varsity Network. I am Greg Smith, your freshly recharged after the weekend and ready to attack the week friend. Today, I am joined by the Director of Name, Image, and Likeness Education for Opendorse and Husker softball alum, Bri Cassidy. Bri, thank you for being on the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad I was able to catch up to you. It's a busy time, and it's funny. It's a busy time for you. You actually have a lot going on. I feel like I have a lot going on, but I should not, because it's technically the off season for football. But as far as recruiting goes, things are just now starting to really ramp up. They had a big visit weekend, and then the rest of the next probably 4 or 5 weeks are going to be extremely busy for me. So we're getting there. I'm coming out of the off season, so thankfully, I had a good weekend. I was able to relax. Did you have a good weekend? Were you able to even relax before the craziness started?
No, I'm starting to hit the road now. I was actually in Denver for a friend's wedding this weekend. Got back yesterday, did some laundry, repacked everything back up, and then hit the road this morning and drove in from Kansas City to Nebraska for our company's HQ week. So right back into it. Right back into it.
So are you like me and you pack like the day that you're leaving, or had you kind of started to sit stuff to the side and you were like, okay, I know this is coming, I'm going to kind of get ready?
I knew what sort of things I was going to need for this week. Like, we're going golfing and doing some other things. So I knew what stuff I needed to have ready to go. Did I necessarily have it all folded out and ready to go before the Denver trip? I didn't, admittedly. Typically, I like to pack things ahead of time. But this time, was just had to work on the fly.
Hey, it's like that sometimes. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about before we get into the meat of the show is, now, your final season with Nebraska softball was in 2019, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so everything is kind of fresh in your mind. I guess first, what did you think about kind of their season this year that they were able to put together?
It was pretty amazing. I talked to the coaches probably at least every week, if not every other week, and got to watch them a few times. They played down in Lawrence when I was working at KU, so I actually got to watch them play in person. Flew out to San Diego for a vacation there, and they were playing University of San Diego against MJ Knighton's team. MJ is my college best friend, so to watch her be able to play against Nebraska was a pretty full circle moment, and then to just watch them go on this crazy win streak. It was pretty much after that weekend. It's amazing. Watching them lose this past weekend, my heart literally broke, because I was so excited for them, and just being able to watch them celebrate after that Big Ten championship. And then just to see the look on those fifth year seniors' faces. I know the work that they put in, and they 100% deserve it. I'm just really thankful that they had the season that they did, and I'm excited about what this younger group is going to do.
Yeah, it was an amazing year in one of those situations where you're hopeful for the future and how bright that could be as well, which is always fun. It's always fun where even though it's tough, like you said, for those fifth year seniors, those veteran players, you still have the feeling that, okay, they're still on the upward trajectory as a program. So that'll end up working out. And one of the things that I always like to talk to when I have former athletes on the show is just kind of an open-ended version of what type of impact do you think that Husker softball made in shaping your life?
Oh, it's everything. I always tell people, when I went on my visit, I was a sophomore in high school, of course, before the recruiting rules changed. And I went in first week of February. If anybody knows anything about Nebraska in the first week of February, it's probably ridiculously cold. It was -3 degrees, full-blown blizzard. Being a kid from Southern California, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Got on a taxi, rode in from Lincoln Airport straight to Bowling Stadium. Wearing this really lame, what I thought was a coat back then. That's a coat in the version of California. And I tell people that because it's I could have went anywhere else that had this beautiful weather, all of the other things. But the fact that by the end of my visit, I was calling home to my parents and saying, I'm coming here. And they were like, get your butt home first before you decide to make any decisions, and give them an answer. But as soon as I got home, I just filled them in on everything. And things that they had already known about the coaches up to that point, because they were one of the only staffs that I was getting recruited by that asked about my family. They understood the dynamics. They knew what it meant for me to be a first generation. They knew about my younger brother. They knew what my education pursuits wanted to be, the things I was passionate about that had absolutely nothing to do with softball. And I knew that if I was going to go 1,200 miles away from home, that I was going to need to be around people that cared about me and were going to take care of me like family. And that's exactly what they did, from the resources Nebraska provides to their student athletes to just the care that Coach Ravel and her staff takes for their players. It's second to none, and I wouldn't have changed it anyway. And I always tell people it's something special. I actually had a COVID wedding where my wedding got canceled in 48 hours because it was in March of 2020.
Oh, wow.
Softball season had just gotten canceled. The first person I called was Coach Ravel. I said, "Hey, Coach, we're not going to Hawaii. What are you doing on Monday?" And she's like, "Nothing, because season just got canceled." And I'm like, "Well, I need you to be at Pioneers Park in Lincoln, Nebraska at 11 a.m. on Monday. Will you marry me?" And she's like, 100% yes. So she showed up. The whole staff was there. There were maybe only 4 or 5 people there, being one of my former teammates, all 3 coaches, and a couple other good friends of ours. And that, I just tell people that because it's like, in one of the most important moments in my life, they showed up, and I was no longer a player. So the impact that they've had on me is like, I can't even describe it, and I'm forever grateful for it.
Wow, that's an amazing story. You have like, we could do an entire episode on just that, because like it's one of those things where I always describe kind of like what happened with COVID and all of that being, is like, it was a giant shared experience for all of us. And it feels like the more, and now that we've had, I guess, a little bit of time from the beginning part of it, like everyone has like a story. Now it may not be that story. That one is different. But everyone has something where it's like, man, I didn't realize, I knew that I was going through a lot, but everyone had something that was going on during that time.
Yep, no doubt. It is amazing, the things that people have had to go through, and just all the stories that you hear.
Right.
What a time.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, to say the least. What a time. Now, every week we have a couple of segments of the show that are mainstays of the show. The first one is called Coach Speak.
Coach Speak to Real Talk.
And that's where we go over something that a coach, player, or talking head said, and then we give you the straight up breakdown of what they meant. Now, this one is an offshoot of something that I feel like I've been talking about for not a couple of weeks, it hadn't been a couple of weeks, but like the last whole week, it feels like I've been talking about this story because I can't get enough of it for a number of reasons. But this version of it comes from Steve Spurrier, who had this to say about the Jimbo Fisher, Nick Saban dust up, if you want to call it that. He said, quote, "I don't think Saban told any lies in there, so I don't know what Fisher was mad about," Spurrier said to Dog Nation. Since Fisher beat him last year, I guess he can talk now. He hasn't beat much of anybody, but he beat Saban last year, but they haven't won the division or anything since he's been there. Did Saban say something that wasn't true? Steve Spurrier, the king of shade. So, Bri, what does all of that fun stuff mean?
Let's break that down.
You know, it is so crazy to see the things that people are bringing up because of NIL. It's like everyone's talking about NIL, and then they say like interesting things like, "Oh, he only beat him once," or I mean, literally the exact quote that you just said. And it's so crazy because NIL has become that new thing, and people are using reasons like the quote that was mentioned to talk about it. Whereas before NIL, it was like people were talking about facilities, and people were talking about training tables and coaches getting paid, however much they're getting paid, or, you know, whatever perks schools have. Right. And I truly just think like NIL is an easy excuse for people to try and bash one another, especially on a big level like Saban and Jimbo. You know, I think until people have a real understanding of how NIL is truly functioning and the rules and what has to go into it, I definitely think we're going to have more conversations like this pop up that we talk about. But yeah, it's just another one of those things that everyone's going to talk about, any sort of competitive edge that they can have over one another. And it's going to be any excuse in the book, right?
Yeah. And it's a weird one too, right? Because it's not like, you know, like you mentioned facilities, right? So take that example. Facilities is something that like while every school does not have access to the same amount of money to build the same type of facilities, the like parameters are kind of known, right? It's basically, you can only do but so much, no matter how much money you have, and you're only going to spend but so much, right? And so there's kind of guardrails in there because they They just have to be based on how much money you have. Yep. When it comes to what's happening, I guess, with like these particular schools, when it comes to NIL, I feel like the reason why so much conversation is generated, or part of the reason why, is because it's so difficult to know what can and can't be done and what schools should be doing in the situation, and kind of how where we started, and this is definitely something we're going to get into, where NIL actually started and what it was originally intended for and what these guys are talking about are two totally different things. Like, they're not the same. Like, I feel like we need another term, because I feel like you say NIL gets brought up to, have different conversations. I think it gets brought up to just bash NIL in general, when it wasn't supposed to be that.
Right. 100%. I think it's so funny to me, because people think like because NIL has become legal, that the rules have changed for boosters and donors, those same people that help build the facilities that we used to talk about in a facilities arm race. But the thing that people don't understand is, even when you're thinking about collectives, is that the rules haven't changed from the NCAA standpoint. It's that boosters still cannot have contact with prospective athletes. And people think that just because NIL is a thing that they're allowed to, when in reality, it's not. The same people that were breaking the rules pre-NIL are the same people that are breaking the rules now. And that's what people need to focus on. It's like, those are the same issues that we were dealing with over a year ago before July 1 hit. But now people are just using NIL as an excuse to frame it as a bad thing, because some of these people who aren't afraid to go out and do some things, they're publicizing it and using it as NIL. And then, as someone who's in an education role, that bothers me a little bit, because it takes away from like the real true value of what NIL is meant to do.
Yeah, one of the things that has caught me off guard is like how public this has become. I guess I would have, if you had asked me, back when it first went in, like, hey, would people be talking about, I don't know, like the potential of I think it's the Tennessee quarterback, that like the rumors that he has like an $8 million deal in place, or like even not even ones that are that big, but just like hearing about various deals, even I guess at Alabama, the Bryce Young deal that was very early on in this whole thing, that I think was for $500,000, like all of that stuff that has just become really public. And I just didn't see it going that way, because I would think for a number of reasons you would not want that information out there, whether or not you're the school, because you don't want the NCAA to come around looking, which is going to start happening eventually. You would think if you're a player, I don't want, one of my teammates to necessarily know about all of this. And I'm not exactly going to be like broadcasting that. And so it's just interesting to me how that became so public so quickly.
Yeah, it honestly baffles me as well, quite honestly. Like, I think back, if I was a student athlete and I chose to take advantage of the market that Nebraska has, not having any professional teams around, and just the investment that Husker fans have in the student athletes, I would like to think that I would have gotten myself into the mix pretty well, and just being proactive. And I don't know that I would have been out posting like, hey, I just landed $5,000 from said booster because I'm a Nebraska softball player. Like, that feels a little weird to me, but I truly think it's majority of the stuff, like, for example, that comes to our platform, the only people that are involved and notified are us, because it gets disclosed through us, and then the school gets notified, and then in return, the NCAA gets access to those disclosures as well. So it's like, if this stuff has hit in the media, some student athletes, or whether it's their agents, for those who have agents that are doing some of these bigger deals, they're going out and having conversations with people that want to know this information. And I don't know that it's necessarily because the student athletes want it to be out there. I think as long as the right person has the information, they're going to do anything to draw a big headline, like a Tennessee quarterback landing a $8 million deal, for example.
Right. And I think that, and you mentioned before, kind of, to take a step back, like the way that, like us getting away from what the original intention was. So like, if you could explain from your point of view, someone who works in education around this subject, like what was or is the actual intention of name, image, and likeness?
When people think of NIL, they think of all the stuff that's in the media right now, but I'll tell you that 98 to 99% of what's going on isn't what's in the media. It's the fact that student athletes now have the same rights that anyone else on campus up to this point. And they have that same privilege of being able to utilize their name, image, and likeness to go out and make some extra money. Whereas before, you can have a regular student on a campus who was pretty savvy on YouTube, or we think of like, this is stereotypical, but a football player that loves video games, they want to stream on Twitch to draw some viewers and make some money. A regular student could have done is allowed to do that, whereas before, student athletes weren't allowed to do it. And you've seen cases before where student athletes, lost their eligibility because they went viral on YouTube or something else, and the NCAA was able to draw a line to the fact that they had the identity as a student athlete to pull in the revenue that they got. So now it's like, now student athletes really just have the same rights that anyone else does. They can go out and host the camp, do lessons, and put their face on a flyer. Whereas before, if I ever wanted to do lessons or a camp, I would just have to talk to people one-on-one and be like, hey, if you want to do lessons with me, like, that's something we can do. Like, we can't post about it. I can't create a flyer for you to share with other people, because that's something that people always ask, is that I couldn't leverage my image as a student athlete or put my name on a flyer somewhere that I can push out to draw some of those things in. So really, I think it just allows student athletes to engage in a pretty big influencer market on social media. You see lots of people out there, being influencers, going viral on TikTok, all of those things. Now student athletes, they can actually make all of those followers that they have because of being a student athlete worth it to them. And if they choose to go out and, pursue some NIL opportunities, that's 100% something they're allowed to do. But by no means they're not obligated to it. And I truly think it just created some equity for student athletes to make extra $50 here or get a free meal here without worrying that they're going to lose their eligibility over getting a free meal from a local restaurant.
Right. Like the rule about, there was a snacks rule, right? Where
Exactly.
It was an impermissible benefit to get certain snacks, according to the NCAA. So getting rid of all of that stuff, it just alone makes it worth it for me. But it's interesting too, because you mentioned about the camps, and I'm glad that you kind of the camps and lessons and instruction, because that was something that I didn't realize, like how in demand student athletes were for those types of things, because it's something that I've noticed. It feels like, man, almost every sport, it feels like at Nebraska, where I've seen Nebraska athletes doing various camps, whether I've seen, football players coaching like youth football or hosting camps at different places around the state, softball players doing different things. And so was that something that, when you were playing, was like, man, I wish I could kind of do this? Like how prevalent is that for people to be able to do these camps or have the opportunity to do that?
I think it's a big deal. I mean, I tell student athletes all the time when I'm talking with them, there's no one better than them to teach this stuff. They're living it. They're doing it at the highest level. People want them to teach this stuff because their kids, these parents, when they have these young kids, those are the shoes that they want their kids to be in one day. And to be able to have that kind of mentorship is frankly a lot different than someone who's 20 or 30 years out, or someone who may have just been coaching for a long time but never actually played this sport. Like when parents are taking these kids to a Husker softball game, for example, those are the ones that they're looking up to. They're the ones that, they're asking for them for autographs after the game. And as a parent, if I'm thinking about return on investment here for a camp or a lesson, my kid is already going to be more bought into the student athlete that they get to see play every week. And those are they're looking with them, big, bright, wide eyes, and they want to learn from them. And student athletes, they recognize that they were in those shoes at one point. They know what works for them, and they're able to connect in a way that I think is a lot different for people that aren't necessarily living that. So I know for me, like I was able to, build out an actual business as soon as I finished my playing career and doing lessons and camps. And it was amazing just to think about, like, wow, like I can only imagine the reach that I would have had if this is something that I was able to do while I was a student athlete. I was lucky enough to, be connected with some younger people that came to like our yearly like preseason banquets that we did with fans, or the same kid that always showed up after a game wearing number 44, and that was her number now when she plays. So to be able to do lessons with someone like that, who I feel like I can have an impact on, student athletes wanted to do that. They've always wanted to do it. So now that they get to take those relationships to a whole nother level outside of just signing some autographs after a game, I think is pretty amazing. And, now they get to make a few bucks off of the things that they know, which is pretty cool too. So I'm just really glad that they get to, because there's a market for it. People want to buy into it. And I don't think there's anybody better than student athletes to be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things too, and that, being able to, and one of the parts of NIL that I'm really fascinated in is just that the education piece for the student athletes while they're in school, right? And I keep thinking about this. And I was telling one of our coworkers, Steve Mark, about this idea the other day, where I really think that at some point we're going to look back, like, I don't know, it won't be that long from now, where a student athlete was going through like kind of this NIL era while they were in college, and they started a business during this time, and then were able to really hit the ground running and then have it take off after they left college. Like, what do you think is the value of being able to, I guess, kind of get your feet wet as an entrepreneur while they're still kind of within that sandbox of college?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because it's so crazy to think back, even when I was a student athlete, that the only experience or things that you got on your resume were like community service events or things that your team went out and did, or just like involvements with the athletic department and the local community. But now with NIL, student athletes really have an opportunity to build out those resumes. And that's something that I drive home every time I meet with them. I'm like, hey, listen, if you're not interested in making thousands and thousands of dollars through NIL, that's totally fine. But the things that you're going to learn through NIL are going to be things that set you up for 40 years after your time as an athlete. When you learn how to manage your social media and present yourself in a certain way, build out your brand, learn how to communicate with businesses and professionals. When you go into an interview, you've been doing this stuff for 4 years, where student athletes before, they had all the same responsibilities, but they didn't have time to go out and get a job. They couldn't, go out and host a camp or a lesson because they were worried about losing their eligibility. So now I think they're positioned really well that if they start a business during their time, now they're building the business, 3 or 4 years, rather than waiting till they're 21, 22 years old. And now with COVID, maybe 24 years old,
right.
Finishing their playing careers and then trying to start a business and figure out, what in the world do I do with my life now that I'm no longer an athlete? They're able to start some of this personal self-discovery a lot sooner, which I think is really special, because I think we're going to see 3-4 years down the road from now, you're going to see student athletes, when they do surveys with NCAA, that they were able to find a job faster. They knew what their identity was outside of their sport a lot sooner. There's going to be less of a gap to fill once their careers are over, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I think that it's funny. It's kind of like, I think of this in a little bit of a way, like we talk a lot about kind of these big deals that happen. And a lot of times, like they're, football and basketball deals ahead of a guy coming to a campus, or the ones that kind of are now happening with like star players that are already established on teams. And there's a lot of focus on that, the same way there's a lot of focus on players that end up going pro. But it's going to be one of those things. It'll pop up in like an NCAA commercial, right? Because the same way they're like, oh, the certain percentage only, never goes pro. And it could be the exact same way, except you're going to have all these situations, I think, where all of this good stuff came out of NIL, and it was all happening, and it was right there under our noses, but we were all focused on, in fairness, the Jimbo Fisher and Nick Saban arguments about it, which is fun to talk about, but at the same time, I feel like we just should not, it shouldn't be at the expense of ignoring what's happening like over here in a larger bucket of student athletes. Right.
Exactly. It's so funny. I was even having a conversation this past weekend with a good friend of ours that was a college basketball student athlete. And she was like, hey, I've been talking with my family about NIL. And they're like, we think it's so ridiculous, because they see, these Jimbo and Saban conversations or the things in the media of the big deals. And they're like, they think that athletes don't have to do anything to get money, and that they're just showing up and being handed cash for just being there. And I'm like, no, listen, like there's 3 very clear rules that people need to follow. It's that it can't be pay for play. As much as I would have loved to get paid for every time I threw somebody out or got a hit, that would have been awesome. But I couldn't do it, and student athletes still can't do it. You have to do something to get something. Again, you can't just show up and get handed money. You actually have to have some sort of activity, whether that's signing an autograph, doing a camp, making an appearance, posting a tweet, whatever it is. You have to do something in return to get that money or whatever kind of compensation you're getting, whether it's a free meal or something else. And then the last thing is it can't be a recruiting inducement. So the same thing that we talked about earlier is that boosters can't be involved before you've, signed with the school the same way that they couldn't before. So I think when you break it down for people that way and you help them understand like those 3 clear parameters, people are like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Like you actually know the things that student athletes have to do. They understand that they have to do something and that it's not the stuff that you see out there and people are thinking that it's like this free for all free agency thing going on that the media provides. And I think when you help people understand that it's really just creating equitable opportunities for student athletes to make a little bit of extra cash to make their lives better, I think people are like, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the other things too that helps, and I think and just kind of in my like my day-to-day job of covering Nebraska football recruiting, when I talk to recruits and their families about NIL in relation to Nebraska, the one thing they always say is that Nebraska's education around all of this is so much better than other schools. The talk, a lot during last year was, they're far ahead of the game as far as, how that goes. So I guess from your perspective, where do you see Nebraska positioned at this point as far as NIL goes?
Yeah, they're doing a really amazing job. And I tell people that Nebraska has always gone the extra mile for their student athletes, whether that's their PEO opportunities and providing money for student athletes to be able to go out and get an internship or grad school and have a little bit of cash to be able to do some of those things, or a training table. I think it's the equivalent of that in the sense that Nebraska has always been forward thinking and trying to figure out what can we do to provide the best student athlete experience for them. And they understood like, okay, they have this really great life skills team. They're doing all of this life skills type stuff, but now NIL is in the mix. And I think that they just took that on with open arms. And it's like, okay, what do we need to do to make sure our student athletes are doing it the right way? Nebraska is not afraid to recognize that they have a pretty amazing fan base that they knew wanted to engage with it. And I think the thing that makes them different is that them recognizing that fan base, they knew that if they didn't want to end up in the media for breaking some sort of rule, that they needed to educate their student athletes, and they're educating their donors and their local community on how to do things the right way. And that's allowed them to position themselves in a way that they're ahead of the game for sure. And student athletes feel that sense of support because they're able to ask the questions that they need to ask. They're able to engage in the way that they, desire to engage in, and they know that they're not breaking any rules. And I think it just makes it, a lot easier for them. And when you make things easy for student athletes, we're very organized, tell us exactly what we need to do, how to do it, when to do it, what not to do. And when you do that for them, it just makes it like, okay, like I can do this. And I think that's so important. And something that I'm telling administrators all the time is, listen, if your student athletes are going to do this and you want to make sure that they're doing it the right way, they have to be educated. Like you can't use the excuse of, my kids aren't getting any deals, I don't need to invest. And I'm like, maybe they're not getting any deals or pursuing deals because they don't feel like they have the knowledge to. And on the flip side, it's like, if they don't feel like they're supported in it, they're probably not going to do it either. So having that education in piece has been number one for me. Maybe I'm a little biased because of my role, but when I'm talking with these schools, I'm like, listen, NIL is just another one of those things. The same way that schools invest in student athlete development and facilities and all of those other things, it's a part of the student athlete experience that can't be ignored. And when student athletes feel supported through that, through education, it just creates a sense of empowerment that makes them feel like they have a place there. And Nebraska has always done a great job with that. And NIL just happened to be one of those things that they took on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting now because even as we're talking about this, like if you just kind of think about it, because I kind of wrote it down. So Nebraska has now, obviously NIL has come about here over the last year or so, but then, the training table, PEO, life skills, there's probably other things. There was the other new thing. I forget what the actual name was. It was basically where there's only like 15 schools or something like that, being able to give stipends for good grades. I forget what the actual name of that program is, but Nebraska was out in front saying, hey, we're going to do this. I just feel like they're able to, and Nebraska is, I don't want to say they're alone in this because there are probably a handful of other schools like this, but that's a really compelling package of things that are put together. Now, not all of these things were in place when you were in school, but at what point did you realize, like, this place has actually got a lot of stuff like going on that I need to take advantage of?
Yeah, I mean, just in my early recruiting, like going on visits, like you start to pay attention to the things that people show you are, and these are the things that I encourage student athletes to pay attention to is like, is majority of your visit, doing the fancy photo shoots and going on the field and taking pictures in the uniforms, or is it the fact that you're meeting with all the different people in the athletic department that are going to be a touch point of support for you, like who your actual academic advisor is going to be? Do you have a life skills or student athlete development mentor that you're going to be connected with to work on that personal and professional development side? Do you know who you can go to in compliance whenever you have questions that can help you with financial aid or housing or any of those other things that you have to deal with? Like, do you know who your support people are? Are you meeting with them? Are you able to have conversations with them? And that's something that Nebraska does a great job of. So they set that foundation early and you start to learn it, but you don't really understand it until you're in it, or someone's like, hey, yeah, after practice, you can go to the training table and get a pretty good meal. That's a lot different than the dorms. Just understanding, people who went to other schools, like recognizing the things that Nebraska student athletes have is pretty amazing. And they've only done a great job of, working to create more opportunities, like through the Austin case that you mentioned from the NCAA, that schools are now able to provide compensation based off academic requirements or whatever schools are choosing to do. And you can tell that Nebraska was having these conversations before something was in place because they knew that it was coming up. Like they don't wait until something happens and then they have a reactionary response. It's very intentional. And I think when you're in it as a student athlete, you recognize it because someone's like, oh, hey, remember, you can take advantage of this. And it's like, oh, yeah, that's great. But then when you're done being a student athlete, like to have my master's degree completely paid for through PEO and, the College of Business at Nebraska and some different things, it's like, if I didn't go to Nebraska, would I have even gotten my master's? Like, there's no way I could have afforded it. But because of the steps that Nebraska takes and those resources that they put in place, they make it really easy to succeed in your life after sport. And I think that's the gap that when people go on visits, I'm like, how do you not end up here? Because it's like, I get, the big fancy things and, winning X amount of games, but sometimes it's like, listen, you're only going to do this for so long. Some of these other things have to be at the top of your priority list when you're going on recruiting visits.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, every week we end the show with my favorite segment of the week called Put Them on Blast, where we basically put someone on blast for something that they did or said. Now, Bri, I warned you, you're going to go first on this one. So I'm very eager to see who you're going to pick. So, Bri, who are you putting on blast?
Put them on blast.
I'm gonna take a shot at some of the people on Twitter, and there's two, and they're usually the same people. And these people talk about two things. The first thing that they like to talk about is they like to tweet at student athletes who either made an error during a game or didn't get the game-winning hit. It absolutely drives me crazy when I get on Twitter when I'm watching like softball regionals are going on right now, to get on Twitter and to see people just bash student athletes to the point where they either have to delete their social media or, they just turn their stuff off. Like that kind of stuff drives me crazy. We're talking about things like mental health and student athlete well-being. And these fans are like, oh, I'm your biggest fans. They're the first ones to come up after a game and ask for an autograph or whatever. But then they're also the first ones to have some weird burner account with some weird stock picture from online, tweeting at student athletes being like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you dropped that ball. Like you're a disgrace to Husker softball, for example. And that stuff kind of drives me crazy. And then those are those same people that are on social media talking about, you don't deserve these NIL deals. NIL is the worst thing to ever happen to college athletics. It's those same Twitter trolls that I absolutely cannot stand. And I hope that one day Twitter and other social media platforms will have a way to weed those people out so student athletes don't have to worry about them. But being a former student athlete who works with current student athletes, that kind of stuff drives me up a wall, and it takes everything in me to not get on Twitter and start getting after it with them. But I haven't. So
good job.
Bless everyone who does, because, hey, you're fighting a good fight. But sometimes it's not worth it. Hopefully student athletes, can continue to just ignore them and move on and recognize what's important. But those are definitely people I'm not afraid to call out at any time.
That's a very well-deserved blast. I mean, it's wild because I've talked to multiple student athletes, especially football, that say, because that's who I cover, is I don't go on Twitter during the season. Like, we basically delete it, and I mean a lot of them. I'm trying to. It is actually more rare to have someone say, "Oh yeah, I use it all throughout the season," than it would be for the other way, which is kind of sad. When you think about it, like the rest of us, for the most part, get to go on and just kind of enjoy it for in whatever way we want to enjoy it. But I couldn't imagine, like, if I logged on, every time I logged on, you just see scores of replies from people, even the good stuff, like even that would be overwhelming to have happen all the time. So yeah, that's a definite well-deserved put them on blast.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, you see a student, we talk about injuries for student athletes, for example, and you see that they're not playing in a game, and it's like everyone becomes a doctor on Twitter all of a sudden. It's like, oh, it wasn't that bad. I saw it. Like, they're just fine. They're weak or whatever.
I sprained my ankle one day, so it's
when I was a high school All-American, I sprained my ankle. They should be fine. They just need to get out there and play. These kids are too sensitive, so. It is amazing to see the stuff that people are not afraid to put out there on social media.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, my put them on blast is actually it's almost similar to that because there were a lot of Twitter trolls that did this exact same thing. Because my blast is going to just go out to the people that put Andrew Wiggins out to pasture too early and said that he was a bust. So the former #1 overall pick, now with the Golden State Warriors, helped the Warriors go up 3-0 against the Dallas Mavericks, and he finished on Sunday with 27 points and 11 rebounds. Had a really nice game, and including that huge dunk over Luka Doncic, which was just amazing to see, even though it was the challenge situation. But Draymond Green had this to say about that after that game. He said, quote, "That's a guy who's been criticized for being lackadaisical, and the beat goes on. You've heard it all, yet on the biggest stage, he's come through. It's great to me, and it's absolutely amazing to see him pick up his level of play." And it got me thinking about something and this happens all the time in sports, where people are really, really quick to kind of push someone to the side and say, "Oh, they're a bust," or, it's taking them too long, or why aren't they as good as we think they are? Their contract is this, so they should be performing this way, or whatever it is. And it happens all the time, and we're probably all guilty of it at some level as sports fans. But at the same time, I try to remember that people are on different development tracks, right? Like, you never know when it is that it's going to click for someone. And in the case of Andrew Wiggins in particular, I think this is a real great example of your situation sometimes really helps to determine what it is that you're going to be able to do, right? So he gets into the league. He's in a tougher situation, a lot of expectations. He gets to Golden State, where there's already an established culture. There's established players and superstars obviously already on that team. And now he's able to flourish. And he's going to end up being in a situation, I think it's after next season, he's an unrestricted free agent. He will have made, I think it's $170 million, and will be in line to have another huge contract if he had another good season like this. So his story is actually one that has become really cool. And so we got a quick blast going out to the people that threw dirt on him and said that he was a bust.
It is so crazy when you think about, these guys, like when you watch the NFL draft. I like getting on Twitter and reading all the cool, like, inspirational stories and learning more about, like, the personal side of these athletes. But then the flip side of it is exactly what we were talking about. Like, what in the world were they doing drafting him 7th pick in the first round or whatever it is? And it's like, the minute they have one bad game or they have just too many turnovers, it's like, forget him, let him go, like, cut his contract.
Cut him.
Like, just let him go, like, forget it. And I think about that Steph Curry commercial, like, if we're talking about the Warriors, I'm a California kid. So that Steph Curry commercial where he's listening, like, oh, he's too small, or he's not strong enough, or whatever it is, he's not that great of a shooter. And now he's one of the greatest shooters of all time, if not the greatest shooter of all time. And it's like, it doesn't matter how successful you are. There's always going to be people that are going to throw some shade on you. And Wiggins has done a really great job responding. And I'm excited as a California person. I'm pumped that the Warriors are up 3-0 and hopefully, they can bring it home.
God, I got mixed feelings on that because I am. You don't know this. The people listening to this know this. I'm originally from Chicago, but I am not actually. I'm like the only person from Chicago, not a Michael Jordan and Chicago Bulls fan. I'm actually a Lakers fan, and so I have I got real mixed feelings about this Golden State thing getting going. But I will say this: I would much rather cheer for you and these Golden State Warriors than be like, hey, let's have the Boston Celtics win again. Like, we don't need that. So we'll go Team Warriors on this one after, they seem to be cruising against Luka, who I had adopted during this playoff run.
Oh, man, he's doing great. I mean, he put up 40-plus points and still lost, which is tough for him. But when you're playing against a starting five and then some people off the bench like the Warriors have, it's tough to do it alone. So kudos to him for trying. He's doing a great job.
He's giving it a good effort. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. All right. Now that's going to do it for this week's episode. Subscribe to the podcast everywhere you listen to them. Rate us and leave us a 5-star review. If you only leave 4, I'm inclined to think you're a hater and nobody wants that. Make sure you're checking out the other podcasts on the Hail Varsity Network, the Mind Your Own podcast, the Varsity Club, Nebraska Preps post-game show, and the Hail Varsity radio show. You can also check out the Hail Varsity YouTube page. I'm back on there again with a recruiting question video of the week, and we'll have continued content as Nebraska gets going on camp season here. You can also find us on Twitter at Greg Smith HV and at B_Cassidy44. I will catch y'all next week.